Have you ever felt like the world is spinning faster than you can keep up? Like no matter how tightly you grip the steering wheel, life keeps veering off course. Every time you check the news, there's another crisis, another conflict, another reason to worry. And if it's not the world outside, it's the storm inside. Those endless thoughts at midnight, that knot in your stomach when you wake up, the silent battles no one else can see. We live in an age of relentless noise. Social media scrolls, news updates that never end, 1,000 opinions on what you should be, should want, should fear. And somewhere in the middle of all this, you, a human being desperately searching for a moment of peace. But here's a truth most people overlook. The storm isn't out there. It's not in the headlines or the stock markets. It's not in the traffic jams or your overflowing inbox. It's in here, in the restless mind. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." And if you're listening to this now, maybe that's what you've been craving all along. Not more advice, not another motivational quote, but peace. Not the kind of peace that waits for the world to calm down, because let's be honest, it won't. There will always be storms, wars, losses, heartbreaks. The nature of this life is constant change, a tide that rises and falls without asking our permission. But there's another kind of peace, a quiet place within, untouched by the chaos outside. It's the eye of the hurricane, still, centered, unshaken. And the ancient wisdom of Buddhism teaches us that this sanctuary isn't in some distant temple or on the other side of the world. It's here, right now, within you. The question is, how do you find it? The Buddha's path wasn't meant just for monks in robes or sages on mountaintops. It was built for people like us, people caught in the noise, tangled in expectations, overwhelmed by daily life. It's not about escaping the world. It's about moving through it differently, learning to see clearly, to step back from the stories we tell ourselves and realize most of the storms we fight are ones we've created. Imagine this. A sailor lost in a violent sea, waves towering over his tiny boat. He can't calm the ocean, but he can learn to steady his hands. He can learn to ride the waves, to read the wind, to trust the horizon. And in time, the sea that once threatened to swallow him becomes his teacher. This is what the Buddha offered, not a life without waves, but a way to sail through them with grace. In a world obsessed with controlling the uncontrollable, we forget one simple truth. Peace isn't what happens when everything falls into place. It's what happens when you stop needing it to. And so, this journey isn't about fixing the world. It's about understanding it. It's about understanding yourself. What is suffering? Why does it cling so tightly? Is there a way to loosen its grip, to soften its voice, to find space in the middle of the madness? The answer has echoed through centuries, through dusty monasteries and busy marketplaces, in whispered prayers and silent meditations. And now it waits for you. A simple, ancient path, not always easy, but always worth it. It begins, as all things do, with seeing clearly. Not through the fog of fear or the lies of ego, but through the simple, unflinching truth of what is. Because you cannot outrun the storm, but you can remember who you are in the middle of it. And maybe, just maybe, in that remembering, the storm begins to quiet. There's a question that quietly haunts every human life, not always spoken aloud, not always conscious, but it lingers in the spaces between our thoughts, in the silence after a heartbreak, in the restless moments before sleep. Why does it hurt to be alive? No one escapes this question, not the rich, not the holy, not the strong, because no matter how carefully we build our lives, how tightly we grip what we love, it slips through our fingers. The Buddha saw this, not as a pessimist but as a physician, a man who gazed unflinchingly at the raw wounds of existence and named them. He called it Dukkha, a word that's often translated as suffering, but it's so much more than that. It's the dissatisfaction that hums beneath our pleasures, the ache of wanting what we cannot have, the fear of losing what we do, the restlessness of a mind that chases after something, anything, to fill the silence. You feel it in the small moments. When your favorite song ends too soon, when a perfect sunset fades into darkness, when the laughter around the dinner table leaves you a little emptier than before, and in the great moments too, when someone you love slips away, when your body betrays you, when the world reminds you how fragile it all is. This isn't some punishment. It's the nature of a world built on impermanence. Everything you cling to is already changing. Everything you fear is already passing. And yet we cling. We reach for permanence in a place that cannot give it. The Buddha taught that dukkha arises from this very clinging. From craving, tanha, the thirst that drives us to grasp, to hold, to possess. We crave pleasure. We crave identity. We crave certainty in an uncertain world, and so we suffer. But here's the part most people miss. The Buddha didn't stop at diagnosis. He didn't leave us with a bleak truth and no escape. He pointed to the door. He taught that suffering isn't inevitable, not in the way we think. Pain will come, yes. Loss is part of life. But the endless mental war we wage against reality that we can release. You see, dukkha isn't just the pain of what happens. It's the resistance to it, the refusal to accept the ebb and flow, the stories we tell ourselves about how it should have been, how it shouldn't have ended, how it should be ours forever. A storm passes through a valley. The trees bend, the rivers rise, and then it moves on. But the human mind, it clings to the storm, replays it, rewrites it, turns a single moment of pain into a lifetime of suffering. And yet, within that very realization lies our freedom. When you start to see suffering not as your enemy, but as your teacher, something begins to shift. It's not about denying the pain. It's about witnessing it without adding fuel to the fire. About asking not why me, but what is this showing me? The monks of old would sit for hours in meditation, watching the ache in their knees, the flicker of anger, the wave of sorrow, not trying to fix them, but to understand them, to see them as passing weather in the sky of the mind. You don't have to shave your head or leave your life behind to do the same. It starts the moment you stop running, the moment you turn toward your suffering and name it, not as a curse, but as a doorway. There's a beauty in this ancient honesty, in knowing that suffering connects us all, that beneath our masks, every stranger you pass is carrying a weight you cannot see, and that in your own darkest nights, you walk a path countless others have walked before, a path that, with patience, can lead to peace. The Buddha's first noble truth wasn't meant to depress you, it was meant to free you. Because when you finally stop pretending that life should be perfect, when you stop expecting unbroken joy and endless victories, you make space for something deeper, a quiet resilience, a peace that isn't tied to outcomes, a wisdom that whispers, this too is part of the path. And with that, the storm inside you begins to lose its grip. Once you realize the nature of suffering, that restless ache within, the craving that drives us, the illusions we chase, the next question becomes inevitable. If this is the storm I'm caught in, how do I find my way out? The Buddha didn't leave us lost in a maze of philosophy. He gave us a map, a path not etched in stone, but written into the very fabric of what it means to be human, a way to navigate the chaos within and without. It's called the Noble Eightfold Path, not a list of commandments, not a doctrine to memorize, but a living, breathing guide for those brave enough to meet life as it is. 8 simple, profound principles, each one a thread, and together they weave a net strong enough to hold you through life's storms. It begins with right view, not just seeing things, but seeing them clearly, peering through the fog of your assumptions, your fears, your old stories, and recognizing that life is fleeting, suffering is real, and peace is possible. It's a shift from, why is this happening to me? To, this is the nature of things. From resistance to awareness. Then comes right intention, because what you plant in your mind shapes the world you inhabit. Is your intention rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, or in kindness, compassion, and wisdom? This is where the journey turns inward. Not just what you do, but why. Next is right speech, a powerful reminder in a world drowning in noise. Every word you release carries weight. It can soothe or wound, build or destroy. Truthful, kind, and timely words become seeds of peace, while careless ones sow storms. And then right action. Simple, ancient, and endlessly relevant. Do no harm. Uphold honesty. Live in a way that leaves less suffering in your wake, not as a moral badge, but as a reflection of a mind at peace. Right livelihood follows. How you earn your daily bread matters. Is your work built on exploitation, deceit, or harm? Or does it nourish life, offer value, and uphold dignity? Your livelihood shapes your mind more than you might realize. And then comes what many forget: right effort. Because peace isn't passive, it requires vigilance. Guarding the mind against unwholesome states, cultivating what uplifts, and having the courage to start again when you inevitably falter. Right mindfulness is the heart of the path. The steady, unflinching awareness of what's unfolding within and around you. The breath as it rises and falls. The flicker of anger. The warmth of sunlight on your skin. Mindfulness isn't about escaping life, it's about fully arriving in it. And finally, right concentration. A collected, steady mind, not scattered by endless distraction, not lost in fantasy or worry, but settled, clear, and open. The kind of mind that can weather any storm. These 8 steps aren't to be walked in order like stones on a path. They weave through one another, each supporting the next. A spiral rather than a straight line. And every time you forget, every time you stumble, you begin again. There's a quiet, radical power in that. Because this isn't a promise of a life without pain. It's an invitation to meet your life differently. To move through it with a steadiness not dictated by gain or loss, praise or blame. To realize that inner peace isn't something you find at the mountaintop or after years in a monastery. It's something you cultivate here in this messy, imperfect, beautiful life. When you speak truthfully to a friend. When you let go of a cruel thought before it takes root. When you pause before reacting. When you choose compassion over bitterness. In those small moments, you walk the Eightfold Path. It's a practice, a returning, a way of remembering who you are beneath the noise. And perhaps, as you quietly tend to these steps, you'll begin to feel it. A stillness not dependent on circumstances. A clarity beneath the chaos. A freedom born not from escaping the world, but from understanding it. The Buddha didn't offer a path to escape life. He offered a way to embrace it fully, without drowning. And as the old masters would whisper to their students, peace is closer than you think. In the midst of chaos, noise, and endless distraction, there lies a simple doorway often overlooked, yet infinitely powerful. This doorway is called mindfulness. It's not a complicated ritual, nor some distant mystical secret. It's the art of paying attention, right here, right now. Mindfulness is the gentle act of bringing your awareness fully into the present moment, not in the hurried, checklist kind of way, but with curiosity and kindness. To notice the breath flowing in and out, the feeling of your feet touching the ground, the sounds surrounding you without judgment. And when you practice mindfulness, something remarkable begins to happen. The storm outside, the noise, the chaos doesn't stop, but the storm inside, it starts to quiet. You begin to see your thoughts not as commands, but as passing clouds. Your emotions not as overwhelming waves, but as weather that changes. This awareness is the first step toward freedom, but mindfulness is only part of the story. Enter meditation, the deliberate practice that trains the mind to rest, to focus, and to open. For thousands of years, meditators have returned to the breath, to a mantra, or to the sensations of the body, not to escape life, but to see it clearly, to observe without attachment, to cultivate a mind steady enough to meet suffering without being consumed by it. And science is catching up. Modern research shows that regular meditation can reshape the brain, strengthening areas responsible for attention, emotional regulation, and compassion. It can reduce stress, lower anxiety, and even improve physical health. But beyond all the studies, meditation offers something more elusive. It offers a way back to yourself. In a world obsessed with doing, producing, and achieving, meditation invites you to simply be. It invites you to sit with discomfort, with restlessness, with the rawness of your own mind without judgment, without rushing away. And in that space, healing begins. Many fear meditation because it asks us to face ourselves without distraction. But the Buddha showed that this facing is a gift, not a punishment. Because when you look deeply, you start to see patterns. Patterns of craving, of fear, of resistance. And with awareness comes choice. You're no longer at the mercy of your impulses. You begin to respond, not react. To move with wisdom, not habit. The breath becomes an anchor, a friend, a refuge. And slowly, over time, the restless mind finds rest. The endless chatter softens. The heart opens. Mindfulness and meditation don't promise a life without storms, but they teach you how to stand in the rain without being swept away. They help you discover that peace isn't a distant goal. It's the quiet space beneath the chaos, waiting to be uncovered. In that space, you realize the truth of the Buddha's teaching. That while you cannot control the world outside, you can train the world within, and with that you begin to live fully, not in denial of suffering, but with a courage and clarity that transforms it. Life is a river, constantly flowing, never pausing. Everything we cherish, everything we cling to, relationships, possessions, even our own identities, they are all in motion, changing, dissolving. This is the hard truth that the Buddha gently revealed. Impermanence, Anicca in Pali. Nothing lasts forever. Nothing stays the same. And yet our natural instinct is to resist, to hold on tight, to grasp, to control, to secure our happiness as if it were a solid thing. But what if the very act of holding on is the cause of our deepest suffering? Imagine clutching a handful of sand. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips away. The more you struggle to keep it, the more it escapes. This is the art of letting go, not as a loss, but as a liberation. To embrace impermanence is to awaken to the reality that life is a series of moments, ever shifting, always fragile. It's to stop fighting the natural rhythm of change, and instead, flow with it. Letting go doesn't mean giving up or becoming numb. It means choosing freedom over fear. It means releasing the need to control what is uncontrollable. When we hold on, we build prisons, walls of expectation, resentment, and anxiety. When we let go, we open doors to compassion, to peace, to a deeper connection with life as it truly is. Buddhist teachings offer practical tools for this practice. One of the most powerful is the contemplation of the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. By reflecting deeply on these truths, we begin to see that attachment is a trap. Our desires for permanence, for a fixed self, for unchanging happiness, they bind us in chains of dissatisfaction. But when we loosen our grip, even just a little, a vast space opens up. The mind breathes easier. The heart softens. We discover the courage to face loss, disappointment, and change, not as enemies, but as natural companions on our journey. Letting go is also an act of trust. Trust that life, in its unfolding mystery, carries you forward. Trust that peace is not found in possession, but in presence. Trust that beneath the surface of impermanence lies an unshakable ground, the luminous truth of interconnectedness. It's in this surrender, paradoxically, that we find strength. Because when you stop fighting the current, you can swim with grace. When you release what weighs you down, you rise. And in that rising, you glimpse the freedom the Buddha called nirvana, a state beyond grasping and craving, beyond clinging and aversion. Here, suffering loosens its grip. Here, the storm within begins to settle. The journey of letting go is ongoing. It requires patience, compassion for yourself, and gentle persistence. But each step forward is a step toward peace. And as you walk this path, you begin to live more fully, not in fear of loss, but in awe of the present moment's precious, fleeting beauty. If Chapter 5 showed us the power of letting go, then Chapter 6 invites us to open our hearts wide and fearless. Because peace is not found in isolation. It is discovered in connection. The Buddha taught that all beings are woven together in a vast, intricate web of life, a profound truth known as interbeing. Every breath you take, Every heartbeat, every smile, and every tear is linked to countless others. You are never truly alone. This understanding reshapes everything. When you see yourself not as a separate island, but as part of an ocean of life, compassion naturally arises. Compassion, the active wish for others to be free from suffering, is the heart of awakening. Why? Because suffering is universal. Each of us carries invisible burdens, silent storms. To recognize this, to truly feel it, is to bridge the gap between me and you. It dissolves barriers built by fear and misunderstanding. Compassion connects us. It softens the edges of anger and judgment. It invites patience, kindness, and healing. But compassion is not just an emotion. It is a practice, a daily commitment to see others with the same care and respect you wish for yourself. In the Buddhist path, compassion walks hand in hand with wisdom. Wisdom sees the impermanent, interconnected nature of all things. Compassion responds with a heart open enough to embrace that truth. Together, they form a balance, a dance between clarity and warmth. In a chaotic world, this balance is revolutionary. It changes how we relate to ourselves, to others, and to the environment around us. Imagine a world where people meet suffering not with indifference or blame, but with understanding and support. Where kindness becomes a ripple, spreading far beyond the initial act. This is the peace born from connection. And it starts with small, mindful acts, a smile to a stranger, a listening ear to a friend, a moment of silence for those in pain. These gestures may seem simple, but their power is immense. Because compassion transforms both the giver and the receiver. It dissolves loneliness. It builds bridges. It plants seeds of peace. As you cultivate compassion, you also cultivate self-compassion. The ability to be gentle with your own flaws and struggles. This is essential because the path is not always easy. There will be times of doubt, of pain, of feeling overwhelmed. But with compassion as your guide, you learn to hold yourself with the same kindness you extend to others. In this way, peace grows not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing reality, rooted in connection, nourished by love, and strengthened by wisdom. When the heart opens like this, the storms within settle more deeply than any meditation alone could achieve. You begin to live not just for yourself, but for all beings, a life woven into the vast, beautiful tapestry of existence. Here we arrive at the close of our journey, yet the true path has only just begun. In a world swirling with noise, distraction, and endless change, the search for peace can feel like chasing shadows. But as we've discovered together, peace is not a distant destination. It's not hidden in some far-off land or waiting for the perfect moment. Peace is a sanctuary you build within, a refuge of stillness, wisdom, and compassion that no storm can shake. You've seen how suffering touches us all, how the Eightfold Path lights the way, how mindfulness and meditation calm the restless mind, how letting go opens the door to freedom, and how compassion connects us deeply to life itself. This sanctuary is yours to claim. Moment by moment, breath by breath. It's not about perfection or escape. It's about showing up for yourself, with honesty, patience, and courage. And when the world feels overwhelming, remember this: the greatest peace comes from embracing the chaos without losing your center. Your sanctuary is alive in your practice, your choices, and your heart. It's the quiet space beneath the noise, always there, waiting to be discovered. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this journey has touched you, if these words have sparked something inside, please consider subscribing to the channel, hit the like button to support, and share with others who might need a moment of peace today. Together, we can create a community rooted in wisdom and kindness, a sanctuary in the midst of life's storms. May you find your own peace, deep, lasting, and unshakable. May you carry that peace into the world, and may it ripple outward, touching countless hearts. Until next time, be well, be mindful, and be kind.